you really are talking my language here because one of the things that I like to talk about is sort of the AI life cycle, right? And so what is the AI life cycle? So a lot of times when we talk about AI, we're so focused on the actual model, right? The model performance, the area under the curve, the accuracy of the model. And to me, that is just one piece in the AI life cycle. So what does the AI life cycle include, right? Well, it starts with the type of data you use to train the model, right? How diverse is that data? What's the origination of that data? In a lot of our work, we're using data from electronic health records from a healthcare system. But it's important to think, and I tell my students this, well, who has access to that healthcare system? And more importantly, who doesn't? Because that's going to define who your model is going to work on and who it might not work on. More importantly, when you think about who's coming to the healthcare system, when do you go to the hospital? You go to the hospital when you're sick. When you're really sick, and the sicker you are, the more data we have on you. So the model is really good at understanding and predicting these very sick patients. But when you have somebody who is maybe not as sick, they might avoid the hospital. So we don't have a lot of information on those people. The second piece in the AI life cycle is really the constraints we have for using data, right? Certainly in healthcare, we have regulations and policies for how we can and cannot use data. So this also predicts the data we can use to train a model. So let me give you an example. If I'm using data from Stanford Healthcare System, and I want to look at Alaska Natives and, diabetic outcomes in Alaska Natives. That population in my healthcare setting is going to be very small. And so I might have to combine those patients with another group of people just because of my HIPAA regulations. And so that's going to really determine how I develop my model. Right. And so then when we move, like, so on my AI life cycle, we have the data, but the next piece is like, what types of models are you developing? And why are you choosing one model over another? Right. And so in our AI world, right, you can use, I mean, we have so many different tools, a random forest, a logistic regression, a large language model now, right? And so why you choose one model over another is really important when we start thinking about those biases and implementation. Right. And then once you take all of that and put it into your model evaluation, but then that final piece, which is what you were getting at, is really model deployment. And how do we deploy a model into the healthcare setting? And how do we think about those biases, right? Because when we're creating these data and we're generating these data, it becomes very different from the data we see in the healthcare setting. And so we have to think about, clinician biases, healthcare system biases, and that is a huge life cycle that we need to think about with a lot of focus just on one of those areas, which is like model evaluation.
Absolutely. I think it's really. I like this holistic approach that you and your team have been taken to seeing. I like the term like AI lifecycle actually makes a lot of sense in the healthcare setting, and specifically. I know there's going to be pushback in terms. Some people are going to push back in terms of like in the healthcare setting from a deployment perspective. What do you mean by bias? Maybe you can give an example of where maybe bias could manifests itself or how it manifests itself in the kind of deployment. And any example would be great.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And so let me give you an example. I'm like thinking of an example right now. So when we deploy a model in healthcare, there's several different ways it can be deployed. So if we think about a prediction algorithm, so let's say I'm providing a risk score for a patient. And I'll give you like just a hypothetical example. Let's say I'm developing a risk score for a patient who's starting chemotherapy for cancer treatment. And I want to predict how well they're going to respond to a particular chemotherapy. And so What I might develop might be a XGB boost model that's going to provide me a risk score on the scale of 0 to 1, and I might define a threshold for when that patient might be considered high risk. So let's say arbitrarily, I might define a threshold. So if a patient has a score over 0.75, I might say they're at high risk for an adverse event with that chemotherapy. But how I provide that to the healthcare system, right? Do I just say, give them a flag, red, green, yellow, high risk, low risk, or intermediate risk? Do I say this patient is high risk because their white blood cell count is extremely low? Uh, do I, provide them with actual numbers and confidence intervals and uncertainty estimations around that risk score? So these are all decisions we make in the deployment space, and how that information is interpreted can introduce bias into the healthcare system, right? So for example, if I'm providing a red, green, yellow flag to a very experienced oncologist, they might say, you know what, I know I've been doing this for 25 years, I know more. They haven't provided me enough information about how they came up with this number. I'm going to ignore it. Or the opposite, this is AI. I believe it. Even though I might not think this is the right thing, I've got to trust it. So it can go in all of these different directions. And so that's why when we think about model deployment, like the explainability and the transparency is so key to ensuring that, we take these biases into account. So for example, if I give this risk score to an oncologist and I say, you know what, I'm, 75% certain that this patient will have an event, or you know what, I'm 50% certain that this patient will have one of these events. That might be interpreted differently by different people, but it might provide enough information to know whether they can trust that risk score or not.